25 years, first for the British government in London, and then in private consultancies over there and here in Atlanta. I'm currently director of Get the Data, a company based in London and Atlanta, and we run evaluation programs in the UK, in Georgia, and in the US Virgin Islands. This seminar is entitled Evaluation 101 and will provide a general introduction to the subject. The intended audience is individuals who are interested in becoming evaluators, those who are perhaps working in policy making in government, or those who are working for NGOs or not-for-profits who would like to commission a good evaluation or who want to understand how to put evaluation findings to good use. But I know from the attendance list that there's many seasoned evaluators with us today, and I'm very grateful for that. And I know we probably all in the discipline have different strengths and approaches to evaluation. So in the course of the next 40 minutes, we're really going to be tackling three questions: why evaluate, who evaluates, and how to evaluate. And I'll end with a case study of an evaluation that I did with my colleagues just a couple of years ago in England. And I hope that sort of case study kind of realizes and makes real some of the things that we've discussed today. So why evaluate? Well, Milton Friedman, whose quote this is, was of course a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And I always like this quote. It makes us think about the role of evaluation in determining the success of a policy or a program. And as we'll find out later, understanding the intention of a policy or program is important. But as the old saying goes, the road to perdition is paved with good intentions. So what an evaluation does is to determine whether a program actually received its results or outcomes. And a really good evaluation will also explain how those results came about as a result of the intervention. That is to say, how you could attribute the outcomes to the intervention itself. And in my experience, policymakers and practitioners are all well-intentioned professionals who want to make a difference. So where does evaluation and evaluators come in? I really love this quote from Michael Quinn Patton. He undertakes developmental evaluation. And in its full form, the quote says, "As not everything can be done, there must be a basis for deciding which things are worth doing. Enter evaluation. Evaluation at its best distinguishes what works from what doesn't and helps identify effective change makers." Now, I share these words with you as I believe that they sum up very well how evaluators, people working in government, people working for NGOs and non-profits can work together in a coalition to benefit society. Because I see that evaluation helps us to direct where scarce resources should go. And programs can use this information to help discern what is useful to do and what is not. And evaluation not only assists change makers, but it helps to identify who they are. So whether you're attending this seminar as a policymaker or the provider of a service or as an evaluator, you might consider yourself to be a change maker. And if so, that's great. And we can learn a little bit more about how evaluation services can make you a more effective one. Now, bringing about change, as I said, involves a coalition of policymakers who define policy, practitioners who implement it, and evaluators who determine whether it's working or not. And ideally, I see these groups as working together in what I call a virtual cycle, with the evaluator feeding back the evidence that helps to refine and replicate a policy or practice and its implementation. Now, when I was working for the British government, this was often called, rather clumsily, the ROMF cycle, which stood for Rationale, Objectives, Appraisal, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Feedback. And that's a topic in itself that we might consider in a future webinar. But basically, the evaluators working with practitioners and policy people, helping to refine things and feedback information. Now, as we close this section on why evaluate, it's worth considering a little more about who are these evaluators, how they are organized, and what is the role for Caribbean Evaluators International. Now, evaluation is not an organized profession with any particular set entry qualifications, and in that way it differs from the law or medicine or accountancy. However, I believe that a good evaluator should be qualified, skilled, and committed. Very often, people like myself gain their evaluation qualifications during their graduate or postgraduate studies. And the skills I see that a good evaluator should have is they certainly must be inquiring, they must be curious, they must have a capacity to reason and to handle evidence. They should be organized, certainly numerate, literate, and analytical. And I also see that they should be committed to participating in continuing professional development. And the CEI is here to help all of us develop our understanding of the potential for evaluation in your work. As the mission of our organization says, the CEI is here to increase individual and regional evaluation capacity, advocating for the use of appropriate evaluation practices and methods and the use of regional evaluators. And as a Director of Training and Professional Development, I take that to heart. And I'm here with you to learn and to increase capacity and to learn about new and appropriate practices and methods, and to build up the ability of local evaluators to do good work in the Caribbean region. So as we move to the next session of the webinar, I just we'll consider some evaluation approaches and methods and just begin to highlight them. Now, as we move through some of this more technical material, I thought it would be good to share some what I call evaluation wisdom. And these are really words from some great change makers from history. This one is from Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "You may never know what results come of your actions, but if you do nothing, there will be no results." So often here in the evaluation world, we're working with people who are making a difference, who are doing things and bringing about change and results. And I just hope that these words might be slightly more inspiring than my own technical wisdom. So thinking about how to evaluate, this could be the subject of other webinars in the future. We could have a course dealing with some of the things that we'll just be able to touch upon this afternoon. But there are many different philosophies about how to evaluate a policy or intervention, and there's many different thoughts about the role and the status of the evaluator. I'll touch on some of the principal approaches and methods in a moment. And I'll also begin to introduce the sort of ideas of experimental or quasi-experimental approaches and also theoretical approaches. As I say, any of these could be topics for a full 40 minutes, but we'll just touch on them and get you acquainted with them. And I'll end, to sort of remove the kind of abstract nature, we'll end with a case study that kind of brings a lot of this together. So the principal approaches of evaluation are often said to be summative and formative evaluation, and these are perhaps the classic distinction over the different types. Summative evaluation most often takes place on the completion of an intervention and is more focused on what outcomes were achieved rather than the process that brought about the outcomes. So it is very kind of classically done at the end of the life of an intervention, and it kind of assesses how successful the evaluation was at achieving its results. A formative evaluation, in contrast, takes place during the lifetime of an intervention and is more concerned with examining the process and monitoring how those processes are bringing about the outcomes. And as the name suggests, it helps to form the intervention and help to make any changes to improve the intervention's likelihood of success. And we'll come back to types of summative and formative evaluation in a minute. Now, both of these types of evaluation will rely on quantitative and qualitative methods. Summative evaluation is often quite heavily quantitative, so it's quite heavily numerical, and formative evaluation will often have a more qualitative dimension to it, so there'll be more qualitative approaches. But as I've indicated, quantitative approaches tend to be much more numerical based. They would be structured and statistical, and it would allow us to monitor the intervention's inputs and outputs and to evaluate its outcomes. And it allows us to take to look at many different subjects and individuals and draw general conclusions with confidence. Qualitative evaluation methods tend to be more literal, they tend to be more fluid and inquiring, and they enable us to understand what an individual's motivation and thinking and attitudes might be. And it allows us to think more deeply on a smaller sample about how a program is operating. Turning then to experimental approaches, they're often a much more experimental or quasi-experimental, are often said to be more scientific and statistical or numerical in approach. They're often likened to laboratory research, for example, administering a new drug or the placebo to a group of research subjects and then evaluating the results. In social research, experimental or quasi-experimental designs often measure the change between the baseline and the final outcomes and use a comparison group or a counterfactual to determine the link between the intervention and the outcome. So it can rule out or can be much more certain as to whether it was the intervention that brought about the outcome rather than something else. Now, it might be that you've heard of randomized control trials, which are the purest form of experimental design, or a matched comparison group, which might be a quasi-experimental design, but which tries to match the intervention with a comparison. Now, in social research, there are some practicalities to this in terms of time and cost. It can be quite costly to spend the time to create a control or a counterfactual or a matched comparison group. And that might be outside of the budget of your client, or it might be outside the skill of you as an evaluator. There are also some ethical considerations, rather particularly with experimental approaches, where people might not have a choice of whether or not they get the intervention. So in social research, we're not really in the scientific laboratory, so there are some ethical considerations that we would have to consider. But overall, often experimental design is criticized for working within a black box and ignoring the context in which the intervention was delivered, or it's limited in being able to delve more deeply into how the intervention was implemented.
You mean the plastic cases? Two?
Yes.
3 cases, eh?
Hello.
One or 2 cases, anyway. Yeah.
Welcome to the webinar. Would you mind just muting your volume, and we'll take any questions at the end. Thanks.
And
want to make sure everyone's muted, but I hope everyone can still hear me. So some of the limitations of the experimental approach means that we can't really delve outside of the black box of data and understand how an intervention was implemented. A theory-based approach is one, in the course of my 25-year career, I've become perhaps much more dominant in evaluating programs and interventions. It could be said that they're often the mainstream or the stock in trade of evaluators working in government or non-governmental organizations or the independent sector. And the advantage of theory-based approaches is that they help in the design and the description and the measurement and evaluation of a program or intervention. So they're much more formative. It's often said that they perhaps use much more sort of logical sequencing. So one thinks about resources and one thinks about the inputs which go into a program, the type of interventions that come out of that, or the outputs, and then the impact of the outputs on individuals in achieving outcomes. And so that's important. So rather than kind of looking, it seeks to understand the intervention by what the funders and practitioners and service users are seeking to achieve, and making sure that all these things have a logical sequence. In addition to understanding how the interventions and processes led to the outcomes, the theory-based approach is often able to understand the impact of the context of the program, and that can often be important to replicating the program elsewhere. I hope this slide comes up quite readily. I've actually got a handout that anyone who would like this, I can send this to you. Some of you will be familiar with logic models. This would be the kind of start of a logic model, delivering a framework for monitoring and evaluation. But you can begin to get the kind of logical sequencing of data, the logical sequencing of an intervention. So the resources are the financial resources that an organization has to spend on interventions. And the inputs are what is needed to deliver that intervention. For example, nurses or resettlement workers, or specialized play equipment, or units of accommodation. And then we're interested to see how those inputs lead to outputs. Now, outputs and outcomes are often kind of misunderstood, but and there could be some debate about their definition, but for this purpose, really, the outputs are the final service that are delivered to the clients. For example, the number of counselling sessions that might have been delivered, or the number of drug treatment sessions that were provided. The outcomes are the real key sort of evaluation data. And they're measuring the impact on the community or individuals, what the organisation is seeking to achieve. For example, this might be reductions in reoffending amongst young people, or improved educational attainment in school, or increased life expectancy amongst adults. So we can see that there's a kind of logical sequencing of these. Resources and inputs and outputs might be more monitoring data that we're keen to see, count the numbers and frequencies of particular activities, and the outcomes are often the more evaluative data that we want. I've added in here the context and how the context impacts on the outcomes, and that might depend on the geographical area that you are running the intervention. It might be about the way in which you've arranged your resources and the qualifications of the people who are delivering the interventions, or the numbers of people that you're able to recruit into the program. But that's an important aspect to it. And then we can begin to get some measures of economy and efficiency and effectiveness. So get measures of economy, so that we're looking at the costs of acquiring the inputs to the program. For example, the cost of acquiring social housing units. We'd be looking at efficiency, so obtaining the maximum output for the inputs. So you want to perhaps providing group counselling might be more efficient, you're getting to see more people, but it might be less effective. And of course, effectiveness is whether or not the outputs of the programme are leading to the desired outcomes. And then overall, there would be some element of cost effectiveness. This is quite a detailed slide, so there is a handout that I provided, and if anyone wants to get a copy of that, then just ask for that at the end of the webinar and I'll send it to you. But this is really just a way in which I want to encourage people to begin to think about creating a monitoring and evaluation framework, and just thinking about that logical sequencing that comes into the theoretical approaches to evaluation. Now, what I've talked about at the moment is quite theoretical and also quite technical. So I thought I'd sort of bring them all together in a case study. And this is really a case study. I hope people can see this again. I can send this to people, a clearer version at the end of the webinar. But this was really a poster, an infographic that I prepared following an evaluation of a programme in Surrey. And if you look at the map of Great Britain, Surrey is that county just to the south of London, which is coloured in red with a big arrow pointing to it. It's quite an interesting county. It's just to the south of London. The southern part of the county is very affluent, and the northern part of the county is kind of suburban London and can have areas of deprivation. The evaluation was really for change makers. We've talked about change makers and the role of evaluation in that at the start of our webinar. Our client was Surrey County Council and Surrey Police, and both organisations wanted to change the way they dealt with young offenders. And the way in which they wanted to do this was to divert young offenders out of the criminal justice system and into a system of restorative justice. So rather than arresting young people, taking them to the police station, reprimanding them or charging them with an offence and sending them to the youth court, the young people who were arrested for offending were diverted out of that system altogether and into a restorative justice system. Now, the principles of restorative justice are quite interesting. They tend to be based on a form of mediation between the victim and the offender, and really try and understand what happened from the perspective of the victim and the offender, so the offender can explain why he or she committed the offence, and the victim can explain the impact on them. Now, the client wanted to obtain objective evidence. This was quite a radical departure, as you can imagine. So they wanted objective evidence that the restorative justice approach was more effective than the traditional youth justice approach in reducing offending behaviour. And they also wanted to ensure that it was saving the local taxpayer money. So it was kind of, it might sound a little bit counterintuitive that you divert people out of the criminal justice system and all the punishment and deterrence that goes with that, and into something which was perhaps much more based on the individuals involved. So we really needed to be sure that we were providing objective evidence. The evaluation design was quite complex, so we used a theoretical approach to understand why the policymakers, the practitioners, the victims and the offenders believed that restorative justice would be more effective at reducing reoffending. And then once that was understood, we were able to use a quasi-experimental design to prove that it was effective. So this was an approach that kind of was a hybrid of the experimental and the theoretical approaches. And I think in the real world, that's a good way of doing things, that you use the theoretical approach to really understand what it is you're evaluating and why, and then use the quasi-experimental approach to really understand why that was effective. So taking the theoretical approach, we asked two questions, and I'm just hovering the mouse around them there. The two questions were, should it work, and can it work? So the should it work questions were answered through a review of previous evaluations of other restorative justice programs to look at whether or not they were effective, and why they were effective, and if they were ineffective, what was it about the processes that rendered them ineffective. So we did a lot of sort of looking at the previous evidence base, and then we interviewed the key stakeholders from the police and the local authority to try and understand why they thought the restorative justice approach would be a better approach than the traditional approach. So bringing together that evidence and also that common sense, I sometimes think, common sense does have a role in practical evaluation. We were able to understand whether it was plausible that the RG approach could reduce crime. So although we couldn't at this stage say that it was effective, at least we came to an idea that it was a plausible approach and that the evaluation could continue. The second question was the can it work question. So having understood what it took to deliver a successful restorative justice program, we then examined whether this one in Surrey had all the correct resources. And that wasn't just the monetary resources, but it was the human resources, the political capital locally, the technical skills, the ability of people to conduct restorative justice conferences to make the program doable. In terms of the political dimension on this, the elected police and crime commissioner had just been elected on a law and order ticket. So that meant that he wasn't particularly disposed to restorative approaches. He was quite against this initiative. So that's why we really needed to get some good data. And it was also an important context locally. So that was an important consideration. So to get that evidence, he wanted to know, well, is it better at reducing reoffending? Is it costing me less money? And also, what do the victims think about that? These were his important questions. So we used a quasi-experimental approach. To get around, there was a blanket policy of all young people would be diverted. So we couldn't sort of create a group of people who weren't diverted, and there might be ethical considerations as to why some people would be punished and some other people would get a restorative intervention. So we took as our comparison group, we matched the cohort that we were looking at with a historical cohort to see what had happened to them. And then this quasi-experimental approach really answered two other questions, which are at the foot of the infographic here. Is it working, and is it worth it? And what we actually found was that the evaluation using our quasi-experimental matched comparison group, we found that the evaluation showed that the reoffending rate of the group of offenders who had received the restorative justice intervention was 6% lower in absolute terms than the historic comparison group who had received the traditional youth justice. So we did find that this was this was more effective in absolute terms. And you can see that by the little graph here. Oops, I've gone on too far. The little infographic here on the left, we have the YRI. Out of the 100 people here, we have those who didn't reoffend, and then the control group there. So it was a success. The other question, again, which is often worth asking, is it worth it? Are you actually doing something beneficial, like reducing reoffending, but doing it in a way that's actually saving people money? And the evaluation found, happily, that this restorative justice approach delivered an overall saving to the public purse of £240 for every young person who went in it. So overall, the saving to the public purse was significant. When you actually looked at the cost data in some more detail, we actually found that the police were spending more money. There was more police resource going into the restorative approach. So the chief constable of Surrey was a little unhappy about that, because she felt that she was spending more money on this approach than arresting people and bringing them into the criminal justice system. So there was a little bit of reassessing where there was a little reassessment of resources and inputs, which took the pressure off the police and into the youth justice system. So there was good evidence to kind of think, well, the system works and it's saving money, but there are points where somebody's carrying more pain, in this case the police. So the evaluation was able to identify where resources can be reallocated and make that better for them. Now, one of the things, the third question was, were the victims satisfied? Now, due to budget constraints, we had limited opportunity to determine the impact on victims. But we did conduct a series of semi-structured interviews with a small sample of victims and found that they were satisfied with the programme. They felt that justice had been done, that the young person who had offended was held to account for his or her actions. And in many cases, they also understood the offender more. And often they said, well, there, but for the grace of God went I as a young person, or they could understand why a young person had behaved. Or if they couldn't understand why a young person had behaved, they felt that their side of the story had been heard. They felt that the hurt that they had sustained had been made known to the offender. And these things are often not, these things often don't occur in court. So the victim actually had a voice where in the criminal courts they often do not. So this is just a case study. I'll send you all this infographic if you're interested. But I think it sort of pulls together and realizes some of the technical and perhaps rather more abstract concepts that we've been talking about, and just pulls them together into one evaluation. Even if it had proved that it hadn't worked, and even if it proved that it was more expensive, and even if it had proved that the victims were dissatisfied, I think the evaluation still would have been worth doing. It just so happened the client was very pleased with it. And it went on to redefine the programme, and they were very interested in trying to increase that rate of reoffending. Finally, really just some other words of wisdom. I like this one from Albert Einstein. As someone who is a bit of a data nut, it's a good reminder. Everything that can be counted does not necessarily count, and everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. I'm sure there's a philosophical discussion on that one. Maybe we'll have that another day. But again, it kind of just, again, we can sometimes get a little bit lost in our evaluation practice. And sometimes it takes the Nobel Prize winners and the superlative scientists just to remind us that there are limits to our practice. Well, we're just towards the end of our webinar. We've got about 5 minutes, I believe, for any discussion or questions, and also future webinar topics. Valerie and I and the board have got some other people lined up, or we're just going to get them nailed down. But we do want feedback from members as to what's going to be useful to you. We've been trying to look at the data to see what our membership might need. But if you could just tell us, that would save any assumptions. So. Yes, and if you want to share, I beg your pardon. Yes, and we're looking. Yeah, I'm not doing all these webinars, but I'm here to host and help people get them together. So, any questions or any feedback? The floor is open.
I have a question. Hello.
Yes. Hello. Could you give your name, please?
My name is Quinn. I'm listening from Haiti. I'm calling you from Haiti.
You're a little muffled. Can you get closer to your mic? Okay.
Yeah. I think mic is on. Can you hear me?
We can hear you better. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. My question is, what I learned is project management is not a linear cycle. It's not a linear process. It's a cycle. So what can we say about like evaluation? Is evaluation follows the same path like as project implementation? I don't know if my question is clear. So when we do evaluation, should we also follow the same path of a project implementation?
I think I understand your question, and it was just a little difficult for me to hear, but I think I understand. I think you're asking whether evaluation should run alongside a project's implementation. And I would be strongly in favor of that. And that would be the kind of formative role for the evaluation, that you would work alongside the project workers from before the project's implemented, and work with them, monitoring what they're doing, collecting data and qualitative data and quantitative data to help them in the implementation of that. And that's what I was talking about, the formative role. When you do that, of course, you have to maintain your objectivity. And I had an interesting discussion with 2 other board members on CEI last month about just that role, you know, about the objectivity of the evaluator, not to do the bidding of the project manager, just to have that independence. But yes, I think that's a very good question. And there is a real role in formative evaluation. Sometimes it's called action research, but it's just that way in which monitoring, it's that way in which evaluation can really help a project's design. And it's a kind of move away from the classical summative evaluation where the evaluator stands quite isolated from an intervention. It only comes at the end and kind of does an audit and maybe does a nice piece of quasi-experimental design evaluation, but doesn't really help. You know, it's too late for the evaluator's work to help. So yes, good question, and I hope I've answered it.
I have another question.
Could you introduce yourself?
Ken Elegant, the same speaker. I don't know if there's someone else on the line, but I have another question about evaluation.
Oh, the same person. Hello again.
The same speaker. Yeah, my question is, should we evaluate an evaluation? Why?
Should we evaluate evaluation?
Exactly.
Well, that's a good question. Who polices the policeman? I'm not sure there are the resources to evaluate the evaluators, but I do think the role of this organization is to ensure that people who go and practice evaluation are skilled enough to do it or know the limitation of their skills, and have a place to go where they can learn skills. So that's very important to all of us on the board. As I say, there's no entry qualifications to the evaluation profession. You don't get a degree like a lawyer, or you don't get barred like a lawyer. You don't, do your medical residency like a doctor. There's nothing like that. So it's difficult to kind of maintain the standards or even set the standards. But I think in our resources as a voluntary organization, and maybe also the Jamaican VOPE working together, we can really kind of help give an idea of what good evaluation looks like and help people realize good evaluation, whether they're evaluators or whether they're policymakers or whether they're practitioners, to know what good and useful evaluation is. So I'm not sure we can evaluate the evaluators, but I think we can do a lot to improve the situation.
Okay, so this is Valerie. Just an interjection here. Do have in a lot of the larger development agencies like the UN, the World Bank, and the IDB, they do have an independent evaluation group. And frequently you will see, I know for the UN in particular, I've seen, you know, a review, they do review the evaluations that they have commissioned. So to just perhaps, because of course they have guidelines that they would like experts to follow. And as part of that review, I think what comes out of it ultimately is, you know, are they asking the right questions and generating information that is usable? So that kind of level, I would say there is some effort at, you know, these agencies kind of evaluating their own, you know, the evaluations they've commissioned and the approaches that they use.
Thank you.
Everybody else?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I am Ayana Samuels from Jamaica.
Hello.
Hello, I don't have, pardon me? Oh, okay, I thought you were saying.
I said welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I don't have a specific question. I just wanted to say how much this really resonated with me. I know you asked whether there are specific topics you'd like us to let you know, specific topics that we would like, and this is exactly where someone like myself who is more nascent within the evaluation journey, where I would have wanted to start. I felt it was very helpful, and I look forward to being able to reassess the presentation because of course it was quite meaty, which is wonderful, but just wanted to give my 2 thumbs up because this already has given me a lot to chew on and has been very helpful. So I think continuing along this place, if we call this ground zero, continuing with case study examples, I think will help us to have a more, shall we say, tangible idea of this field. But I feel very grateful and wanted to thank both yourself, Valerie, and all the other organizers.
Well, thank you very much. That's good feedback. The previous question was, do we evaluate evaluators? I'm sure we should evaluate for ourselves at our presentation. So we will be looking for feedback, but thank you for that. That is encouraging. I think this is the first webinar we've done, and I wasn't quite sure as to where to pitch things. As you said, it was quite meaty. So we will make the webinar available. I hope we're recording it. I hope that's happened so you can review it by watching it. The slides will be available, and if there's any material such as the kind of elementary logic model or the case study that you want to see, then we can make those available. But thank you. That's very encouraging.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any other observations? Or we can close. Ivan, do you have anything to say? I know you were...
Just before you go ahead, this is Dana here, Dana Davis-Smith.
Hello. Hi.
I want to support what was just expressed by our member from Jamaica, but on a fulsome way to Jamaican grouping. Thanks you kindly for the presentation, and we look forward to more sessions like this, supporting ourselves and sharing the knowledge within our group with each other as we build our individual capacities and competencies. So on behalf of Jamaica VOPE, I wish to express our appreciation and thanks to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And nice to hear you again, Diana.
This is Ivan Somlai. I was just notified by Karen Prasad that a couple of comments I had sent out went privately to her, not to the whole group. One was simply a thank you because I did enjoy it, and I certainly very much liked that summative infographic that you had. It encapsulated a lot of work. On the last question about evaluating evaluators, it is possible to solicit feedback from all the people that have been partaking in a particular evaluation. I mean, people that you had interviewed that were part of focus groups and so on. And I've done this in several countries where they gave feedback, such as, just as an example, you know, this particular evaluation result or statement cannot be true because obviously the person didn't speak to the right person or looked at the wrong document or something like this.
Yes.
So it is possible to receive feedback like that.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's great. Well, 2 more questions and then we'll close out. But obviously if people need to get back to work, thank you for attending. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Stand by, but we have time for 2 more questions. So do we have someone ready? Do we have a question lined up?
Hi, good afternoon.
Colleen, hi.
Hi, yes, Colleen Davis from Trinidad and Tobago.
Hi, Colleen. Good to hear you.
Thank you. Before I got the invitation to this webinar, I've not heard of the Caribbean Evaluation International, Evaluators International. So I'm really very interested in learning more about your organization and how you contribute to building the capacity of evaluators in the Caribbean. So of course the webinar here is one of the ideas, but really intrigued to hear more over time about your organization. And thank you very, very much for the invitation.
Great. Colleen, can I just ask what your profession is and what your interest in evaluation is?
I used to be executive director of Quinn, and I'm still very much involved in several NGOs in Trinidad and Tobago. I was qualified actually as a community psychologist.
Okay.
So very involved in community action research, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So basically it's just a refresh and I have a personal interest in having this sector in Trinidad and Tobago become more recognized for the critical work that we do, and recognize that we're often very busy doing that work and not spending enough time doing substantive evaluation.
Yeah.
So anything that could contribute to that kind of thing. Actually just recently enrolled in an Acumen online course looking at social impact. So those kinds of things really, really interest me.
Great. Well, that's great to hear. Well, we hope that you'll join the CEI and learn more. We've just got out our newsletter, which Ivan has put together, and that's a very informative newsletter. Stand by for other webinars, but Colleen, I'd really encourage you to join and become involved and learn and share. We'd love to hear more about what you're up to in Trinidad and Tobago. So thank you for attending. Do we have another question? No? Okay. Well, I'm just going to ask Valerie 2 things. One, to say how we can give feedback. What's the, because I didn't think,
Yes,
I didn't think about it.
Right.
And then just to close out.
Okay. So everyone, hearty thank you for joining. You know, it's our first webinar. This is something that we plan to make, you know, part of our regular offerings. And I was particularly pleased to see Colleen join. I had the opportunity to meet her in Trinidad late last year, and certainly she responded immediately. Once she really keen to roll out more in Trinidad. We have a small grouping of persons there, and a contact person, Denisha Maxim, who is I think you know Denisha, she's with the ministry. But certainly we would love a lot more participation from Trinidad, and yeah, we will look forward to you helping us to roll that out there. And thank you for all of the persons who attended and participated in this way. We will send out an evaluation form. We do have yes, we have a record. We will have a record of who attended, and we'll send an evaluation form out, and please respond so that we can have an idea in terms of content, in terms of format, and so we can improve as we move forward. All right. So, and please spread the word. Our next one of these will be in June. However, we're also looking to, there is an evaluation week, the inaugural Global Evaluation Week coming up in the week of June 3rd to 7th. We will be circulating a lot more information about that, but it's likely that there will be possibly a series of webinars during that week to commemorate the week, and several other activities regionally and country. We hope to have something in each country where we can manage that. So more information on that very soon. So with that being said, we know you've taken time out of your busy work day. Thank you for graphic. Yes, I love when things are just one page. You can see a lot of stuff that way, digestible, and thanks again to all the attendees.
Well, thank you, and we'll see.
All right.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We'll talk
Hey,
to you
Ivan.
Thank you, everyone.
soon.